We'll start, and welcome everyone. I'm so pleased to see such a fabulous audience for Paula's talk tonight. And in some ways, of course, Paula needs no introduction. She's very well known to the Courtauld, having done her PhD here many years ago with pattern lawn. And of course, taught on the MA here for some years with Guido and Scott, and then has been for also many years director of the V&A course. But she's probably best known in her scholarship for her work on the relationships between Italy and the Netherlands. Of course, her book From Flanders to Florence, the Impact of Netherlandish Painting in Italy, it has been a fundamental work in the field. And 20 years ago, I can't believe it's that long that it came out. It still feels fresh, as fresh and insightful today, I think, as it did then when it hit our shelves. Paula has also worked on things like game boards and dancing, which I think says something about her interest in things that are entertaining and fun, and indeed having fun and entertaining, as I know well. And she has recently, of course, and most recently, just published, literally hot off the press, an article in the Burlington this month on Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna and its patronage by Flemish patronage and materials and making. And so that's something that really just sort of expands this field of interest. Justus of Ghent is another one of her hobbies, I'd say, but quite a serious one has been at the moment. And this talk that we're going to hear tonight comes out of a fabulous paper that Paula gave at a conference in Urbino in Rome on Justus of Ghent that really did help us all rethink the questions about this artist. And so I really wanted her to come back and give it to an audience in London, and also with a chance of having had the conference and thought about the paintings. And I think the thoughts are ongoing as we will see. It's a complicated topic. I also wanted to point out that this is in a way part of a diptych. So also at that conference, Machteld Israels gave a fabulous paper on the studioli at Gubbio and Urbino, and of course the series of famous men that were made for that those places. And she's coming back to do that also in London on the 25th of November, so please do put that in your diary. And it will, in a way, sort of build on a lot of material that Paul will begin by introducing you to tonight. So I think that's all I need to say, apart from just to welcome Paula with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie, and yes, it's lovely to be here with you all and to be revisiting Justus of Ghent and his Enigma. And as Susie explained, this is very much a sort of precursor to the paper that you'll be hearing in a couple of weeks' time from Machteld Israels. And I think one reason we thought it would be useful for me to present this paper was that it was originally the introductory paper at the conference in Rome and Urbino, so it was very much written as a way for people to sort of get into the topic of justice and the very sort of many complications enshrined therein. And just before I start, it's a huge pleasure actually to see in the audience Francesca Bottacin, who is from the Università Carlo Bo at Urbino and who was one of the key organisers of that conference, and indeed who's really responsible for me giving that paper and hence for me being here with you tonight. And while I'm at it, I did also want to just acknowledge the discussions that I have had over the months when I was working on this material with friends and colleagues in the scientific department at the National Gallery, so specifically Rachel Billinge, Jill Dunkerton and Marika Spring. Okay. Justus of Ghent has been described as the most important Netherlandish painter to have worked in 15th century Italy, documented at Urbino between 1473 and 1475. Yet he is an enigma. His identity is uncertain. Justus may not have been his given name. His oeuvre is surely one of the most problematic in the history of art. It is not large and universally in severely compromised condition. Over the past 100 years, his authorship of every work once attributed to him has been questioned, contested, and in many cases denied, even those that are documented or authenticated by early sources, an issue that has come to divide the scholarship, sometimes bitterly. This debate has become a distraction from other equally pertinent questions. What, for instance, might have been the impact of an experienced Netherlandish master working in a small but culturally significant centre in 15th century Italy, a phenomenon unique to Urbino? How might he have operated and adapted to local practices? And how might this cultural milieu have impacted on him? My intention in this paper is not to resolve, but to revisit the Justus problem, and focusing on the Italian works to raise questions which can form a basis for discussion moving forwards. I am not discussing the Calvary triptych in Ghent, traditionally attributed to him, beyond noting that its recent restoration at the Kik Irpa in Belgium, not yet published, indicates that it was painted by two hands, one of whom may be the same as that which painted the documented Communion of the Apostles in Urbino. Nor am I discussing the Adoration of the Magi in New York, which I do not believe to have been painted in Italy by this artist. It is worth noting that much of the debate rests on scientific research that is now relatively old. Jacques Lavalle's on the works at Urbino in the 1960s, Nicole Reynaud and Claudie Ressor's on the Louvre famous men, undertaken during their restoration in 1984 to 89, and Lorne Campbell's publications on the paintings at Hampton Court and the National Gallery, respectively investigated in 1979 to 80 and 1993. These studies have been crucial to our understanding of the oeuvre, but more recent investigations of the Italian works, notably by teams in France and Italy, are yielding more nuanced results that may lead us to revise our views. But to begin with the documentary evidence. Mastro Giusto da Guanto del Pintore is recorded in payments between the 12th of February 1473 and the 25th of October 1474 by the Confraternity of Corpus Domini at Urbino for their altarpiece, the Communion of the Apostles. The first payment, for wine, probably relates to the signing of the contract. The last records that the painter had been paid in full, but enigmatically adds, quote, non fece al dovere, which literally translates as he did not do his duty, a point we'll come back to later on. And just in case you're interested, here is one of those documents which we were able to inspect at the Confraternity's HQ this summer in Urbino, and I've ringed it around, and this is one of the payments to Justus of the 25th of October. In fact, it's the last one, I think I'm right. There he is, Giusto da Guanto del Pintore. Okay. In early 1482, Vespasiano da Bisticci, the knowledgeable and well-connected Florentine bookseller, visited Urbino, where he was shown around the ducal library by Duke Federico da Montefeltro himself. Vespasiano had been providing books for the library for many years and was therefore well qualified to comment on Federico's tastes. In his Life of the Duke, written between 1482 and 1498, Vespasiano famously relates that Federico, quote, had an excellent understanding of painting, and not finding in Italy suitable masters who knew how to paint in oil on panel, he sent to Flanders to find an eminent master and had him come to Urbino, where he caused to be painted most eminently by his hand many pictures, particularly in his studiolo, where he had him paint the philosophers, poets, and all the doctors of the Greek and Latin churches, done with marvellous art, and there he portrayed his lordship to the life, and nothing but the spirit was lacking." Unquote. Vespasiano does not name the eminent master from Flanders, but since Joseph Crowe and Giovan Battista Cavalcaselle first made the connection in the 19th century, no one has doubted that he was Giusto di Guanto, recorded in the accounts of the Corpus Domini between 1473 and 1475. The studiolo is assumed to have been completed in 1476, the date on its frieze, part of which you see up there, but not the bit with the date on it. Giusto is usually identified with the Ghent painter Jos van Wassenhoven, an associate of Hugo van der Goes, last documented at Ghent in 1468, and who in 1475 was said to have gone to Rome some years earlier. As Jos, Latin Iodocus, is a name that has no Italian equivalent, Giusto, Justus, was used instead in the Italian documents, as in Genoa, where in 1451 the German painter Jos Amann was known as Giusto. We have no secure basis for Giusto Jos's style before his first recorded works, The Communion and The Famous Men. Giorgio Vasari notes in the first edition of The Lives of the Artists in 1550 that Giusto da Guanto painted The Communion and, quote, many other pictures, unquote. Vasari visited Urbino in 1548, just within living memory of Federico and Giusto. If you imagine that somebody who was very, very old in 1548 might just have remembered Federico and Giusto. And so Vasari's source was presumably oral. Many 16th and 17th century writers continued to associate these works with Giusto, including the Urbinate historian Bernardino Baldi, writing in 1604. But by now, an alternative tradition had arisen, associating these works with a Spanish painter. In 1604, the same year that Baldi wrote about them being painted by Giusto di Guanto, who he actually calls German, but the Italian writers at that date often muddle Flemings and Germans. But also in 1604, the Cordoban artist, Pablo de Cespedes, who had spent many years in Italy and could have visited Urbino, mentions in his Discourse on Painting the Castilian Pedro Berruguete, and immediately following this, quote, another Spanish painter, unquote, who was the author of The Famous Men at Urbino. And this placing of Berruguete's name and then comma and then another Spanish painter in the original Spanish text has given rise to immense sort of controversy and acrimony and contestation amongst scholars. But it's really, I think, important, to emphasize that the Cespedes text seems to be referring to two different individuals. In 1632, the French scholar and librarian Gabriel Naudet visited Urbino and had the Communion copied in a sketch, which he annotated, not entirely accurately. I've forgotten exactly, but I think he gets some of the names of people wrong. I think he has this figure here as an angel, when in fact it's St. John, for example. So, he's not 100% accurate, and it is presumably he also who wrote, because this is clearly the same hand, the inscription down here at bottom left. So he annotates it. And since this drawing's discovery in 1997 by Vladimir Juren, attention was focused on its inscription, Petrus Hispanus Pinxit, which may record a now lost signature, or perhaps more likely, oral tradition. The Spanish connection may reflect a cultural shift at Urbino, where by the 17th century, Duke Francesco Maria II had close political and personal ties with Spain. Just to add to the attributional confusion, by the 18th century, the painter of the Communion was sometimes referred to as Giusto da Guanto Spagnolo. The Spanish tradition nevertheless had its roots in fact. In 2001, Fernando Marias and Felipe Pereda discovered a document in Urbino, dated 15th of April 1477, concerning an assault by a member of the Corpus Domini confraternity on one Magister Perus Spaniolus Pictor, resident in Urbino. This document, long considered lost, had been known to the local historian Luigi Pungileoni in 1822, and in the 1920s led Roberto Longhi, Juan Allende Salazar, and Carlo Gamba to identify this Perus Spaniolus as the Castilian painter Pedro Berruguete. Seeing elements in Berruguete's later Castilian work that suggested knowledge of the famous men and Urbinate visual culture, they claimed that he had worked at Urbino in his youth, taking over from Justus of Ghent, who vanishes from the record after 1475. Their suggestion was accepted in many quarters, such that over the years, every work, originally in Justus's, Justo's oeuvre, has been reassigned to Berruguete, whose purported authorship of some of the famous men and the entirety of the double portrait, the discourse, and the liberal arts, which we'll come to in a moment, is often treated as documented fact, which it certainly is not. There is no scope here to go into the arguments which have been rehearsed exhaustively elsewhere, and on which there may never be agreement, but it may be helpful to make the following points about Berruguete. Firstly, his activity is itself very poorly documented. The date of his birth is unknown, as is anything to do with his training. He is first recorded only in 1483, working on a chapel decoration in Toledo Cathedral. And that's already getting on for about 10 years after his supposed stay in Urbino. He died at the very end of 1503. His oeuvre, which seems quite variable in style and quality, has been built around only a handful of documented works. While he apparently knew about Italian art, and I would say his interest in Florentine art and Umbrian art, I think, merits further investigation, the main similarities between his work and the Urbino paintings are, in my view, limited to the Old Testament kings and prophets from the high altarpiece of Santa Eulalia at Paredes de Nava of circa 1490, which recall aspects of the famous men, the most compelling one being King Esdras, whom you see there on the right. Additionally, the architecture in the Decollation of the Baptist from an altarpiece at Santa Maria del Campo of around 1485 has been said to reflect knowledge of the ducal palace at Urbino, although the letters FC and DX over the portal are in fact a garbled misunderstanding of the abbreviated titles FC, seen here, for example, on the balconies of the west front of the palace, for Federicus Comes, and F.E. Dux for Federicus Dux, a title he was awarded in 1474. The Berruguete theory gained endorsement after Reynaud and Ressort in the 1980s found that many of the Louvre famous men had been extensively repainted by a second artist, whom they identified as Berruguete. And the involvement of the second hand is, I think, very evident from these images that I put up here. In brief, St. Augustine on the left, in very poor condition, I think you will agree, was nevertheless shown by Reynaud and Ressort to have been entirely by a single hand whom they identified as hand A, that is Justus of Ghent. So the Cardinal Bessarion, largely by hand A, although in some areas, I think notably the hand, repainted by hand B. And then these two figures, Aristotle and Pope Sixtus IV, very extensively worked over by hand B. In fact, Sixtus IV really quite sort of radically changed. And again, we do not have time to go down the road of the wheres and the whys in this lecture. Now, the discovery of Naudet's sketch from 1637, inscribed Petrus Hispanus Pinxit, led to speculation that he, Petrus Hispanus, also completed the communion. The words non fece al dovere, which you remember in the final payment of 1474, suggesting to some that Giusto had left it unfinished, even though, I would remind you, the document also says he was paid in full, which would be quite odd if he had left it unfinished, in my view. And it should also be noted that there is no mention of a Petrus or Perus in the confraternity's accounts. Ironically, it was the 2003 Berruguete exhibition at Paredes de Nava that prompted some serious questioning of the Spaniards' presence and interventions at Urbino. Not least because new scientific analysis undertaken on his known works, executed in Castile, revealed his underdrawing and painting technique to be utterly different from that of the Urbino paintings. And these were published quite extensively, both in the publications that accompanied that exhibition, the papers of the conference rather, and then subsequently in another scientific publication by Gianluca Poldi, who did the work. And there you can see on the left the Berruguete, a detail of a Berruguete underdrawing, and this a detail of an underdrawing from the double portrait of Federico da Montefeltro and his son Guidobaldo, which you will be seeing in a moment, which is in Urbino and traditionally, often now traditionally ascribed to Berruguete, but ascribed by others to Justus of Ghent. So, I would add to this very obvious, self-evident difference in underdrawing style, that apart from the famous men, Berruguete's Castilian oeuvre contains no resonances of the Communion or any other works that he is supposed to have painted at Urbino. The apparent connection between Berruguete and a relatively limited number of Urbinate works could be explained by the travels of Castilian painters in Italy and the circulation of drawings, or by the presence of Spanish artists in Provence, which is increasingly recognized as a crucible of Netherlandish, Hispanic, Italian artistic exchange. And just to underscore that possibility, I put up another of the Paredes de Nava kings from Berruguete on the left, with a group of similar heads of prophets by the Avignonese painter Jean Changenet. Justus of Ghent is last recorded on the 23rd of November 1475, when the Corpus Domini purchased canvas for a banner, quote, that he was to make at his own expense, unquote. And we don't know whether he ever made it, or if he did, it doesn't seem to have survived. His absence from the record after 1475 doesn't necessarily mean that he had died or left Urbino. It could just be that no documents survive. It has been suggested that he was the Magister Justus de Alemania, resident in Urbino, who made a will and died in 1477, September 1477, but this individual is now known to have been an embroiderer. So we can write him out of the plot. Meanwhile, the enigmatic Perus Spaniolus, Pietro Spagnolo, whose identification with Berruguete is increasingly questioned by many scholars, was certainly resident at Urbino in April 1477. So just to make sure you're with me still, Spanish painter called Piero Perus, resident at Urbino in 1477. We don't necessarily have to assume he is Pedro Berruguete, though. Cecil Clough, however, another great Urbinate historian, noted that Spagnolo was the surname of an Italian family, several of whom were court functionaries at Urbino, although it must be said that none of them are known to have been painters. Whatever his origin, this man was probably a member of Justus's workshop, being a painter employed at Urbino at this time. And it is possible that, like the Valencian painter Luis Dalmau, he had been trained in the Netherlands, or that he gravitated to Urbino via Aragonese Naples, with which Federico da Montefeltro had close relations. And Naples, of course, was itself a nexus of Italian, Netherlandish, Hispanic artistic exchange. Various Italian painters have also been discussed in connection with the workshop, most plausibly Giovanni Santi, although this question too remains an enigma. Rather than speculating on the personnel, however, let's consider how Justus's workshop may have functioned, looking at the works themselves, which for clarity I call the Justus group. In addition to the communion, these are the famous men, which were begun before August 1474, when they were modified by painter B, probably, to include Federico's newly awarded ducal title and the orders of the Garter and the Ermine, which he received in that year. The ermine is just dangling down at the base of that column. Yes, you can see it. It's one of those sort of chivalric golden chains, rather damaged now. And the famous men were completed, as we've already said, by 1476, probably. Then there is the double portrait of Federico and Guidobaldo on the left there, and Federico and Guidobaldo listening to a discourse, respectively painted around 1476 and 1480, judging from the age of Guidobaldo, who was born in 1472. The former painting, the double portrait, has been persuasively suggested by Machteld Israels to have been above the entrance to the studiolo at Urbino, and could possibly, therefore, be the portrait of the Duke that was mentioned in Vespasiano's life of Federico as having been painted by Justus of Ghent. The Hampton Court discourse was perhaps above the door inside the studiolo at Gubbio. Finally, we have rhetoric and music from a series of the liberal arts, now in the National Gallery, of which two further panels of grammar, question mark, or dialectic, no one's quite sure which, but it's this figure here, and astronomy, formerly in Berlin, were destroyed in World War II, but are known from photographs, and the remainder of the series lost without record. From their inscriptions, which are visible running atop these friezes here, from their inscriptions, which include Federico's ducal title, they must date from after 1474. It is often claimed that they were made for the studiolo at Gubbio. This was first suggested by Martin Davis in 1945, on the basis that their imagery relates to the inscription on the frieze above the intarsia panelling of the studiolo, which of course is now in the Met. In 1998, Lorne Campbell demonstrated, seemingly conclusively, that it is impossible to accommodate them within the studiolo in a way that their dimensions, design, directional lighting, and inscriptions make sense. But recent research on the construction of the studiolo by Laura Tesa reopens the debate, potentially enabling these criteria to be met. She argues that the two small windows in the southeast wall of the Gubbio studiolo were blocked up at the time, thereby providing more wall space than had been previously thought existed in the studiolo. And I don't want to develop that argument here because I know that this forms part of the paper that Machteld is going to be presenting here in a couple of weeks' time. So there you go, there's a taster, a teaser for Machteld's paper. But I would say that Gubbio, Federico's second residence and dear to his heart as the place of Guidobaldo's birth, certainly seems a likely contender. The paintings do not appear to have been amongst those recorded around 1585 by Bernardino Baldi in the palace at Urbino, and although Castel Durante, now Urbania, has been suggested, how far building on this palace progressed in Federico's lifetime, or what his vision for it was, is entirely speculative, as is true of another possible contender, the palace at Fossombrone. It is important to stress that none of the Justus group are in good condition, due in part to their later history. All are large panel paintings, many of them so heavy as to necessitate the insertion of special iron fixings into the supports to take their weight on the wall. Beginning in the 17th century, they have undergone several moves, never ideal for large panels, and have been restored at various times. The famous Men, which originally comprised 7 huge panels, each measuring some 240 by 160 centimetres, were taken to Rome on the death of the last Duke, Francesco Maria I, in 1631. By Francesco Maria II, in 1631, by Cardinal Antonio Barberini, together with the double portrait of Federico and Guidobaldo. At a later date, the famous men were sawn into 28 independent portraits, which is how you see them today, which in 1812 were separated into 2 sets. One eventually entered the Campana collection and passed to the Louvre in 1862. The other remained in Rome in the Barberini collection was bought by the Italian state in 1935 and returned to Urbino in 1983, together with the double portrait. The liberal arts, which may originally have comprised 2 or more large panels, also sawn apart and cut down, and the discourse, slightly cut on the left-hand side, turned up in Florence in the 19th century. They were possibly sent there with many other paintings as part of the dowry or inheritance of Vittoria della Rovere, Francesco Maria's granddaughter, who married Ferdinando II de' Medici in 1634. They may be identifiable with the pezzi di tavola in pittura, pieces of painted panel, literally, that were unnailed, literally schiodati, and sawn from the Gubbio Studiolo by 2 carpenters sent from Florence in 1673. Although the Communion remained in Urbino, it was moved from its original home in the oratory of Corpus Domini to 4 different locations in the city between 1725 or thereabouts and 1883. In 1930, it travelled to Antwerp for the International Exhibition of Colonial, Maritime and Flemish Art. It's quite a strange combination, that, isn't it? Anyway, let's not go down that road. It's severely damaged in transport. It underwent a disastrous restoration on its return to Urbino, which robbed it of much of its upper paint layers. Even without being manhandled on 17th century roads, cut and clumsily restored, from the outset these paintings did not have a good prognosis as physical objects. In all the works, the paint layers are characterised by extensive cracks and islands where the paint has contracted, with the caveat that it can sometimes be difficult to distinguish between drying defects, themselves not necessarily the result of poor technique, and over-cleaning. These cracks and islands could be caused by insufficient drying time before applying the subsequent layers, or by applying the paint rather thickly, especially when rich in binding medium, as it would have been, for example, in red lake glazes. Or the oils may have been poorly prepared, perhaps compounded by inexpert paint preparation. Their shortcomings suggestive of a busy workshop seeking to produce works in a Netherlandish oil technique that hampered to varying extents by the requirements of speed and a lack of expertise in the preparation of oils and the application of colour. Justus is unlikely to have prepared the oils and pigments himself and would have had to instruct a workforce unfamiliar with Netherlandish practice, not only in their preparation, but also in their application, with results that were at times less than perfect. He may also have had to cut corners in order to meet deadlines imposed by a patron who desired large decorative cycles painted in oil, but who may not have understood that oil takes longer to dry than tempera or fresco. It is sometimes claimed that Justus was hampered by having to paint on a large scale. This is nonsense. The idea that early Netherlandish paintings were typically small is the accident of survival. The Portinari and Netherlandish painters were perfectly able to produce large panel paintings, the Portinari triptych being an obvious example. In its original state, the huge Communion, spatially ambitious and compositionally inventive, replete with virtuosic details such as gleaming metalwork and translucent glass, must have been an astonishing painting. And I hope you can see that, despite the exceedingly damaged state of this painting, details like the brass ewer and jug here in the foreground, or the brass chalice, or the glassware on the table, for example, must have been sort of dazzling examples of sort of virtuosic oil painting. You have got glimpses of what must have once been very beautiful landscapes seen at either side of the painting. You have got yet another sort of example of shining metalwork here in this niche. The columns of the architecture must originally, I think, have been very splendid coloured marble columns of the sort that you see in paintings by Van Eyck, for example. And I think the lighting on the robe and the sort of wonderful sort of nuancing of colour on the robe of this angel, which is one of the best preserved parts of the painting, perhaps just gives us a little indication of how stunning this must have been in its original state. The workshop was organised to cope with the scale and quantity of production, with tasks distributed to maximise speed and efficiency. New IRRs of the Louvre panels reveal 3 groups of underdrawing, with some drawn freehand and others revealing incised contours, indicating that tracings were used to transfer the designs. And I'm sorry, there isn't really time to go into this in any detail here, but these are 3 different groups of types of underdrawings identified in a recent study led by Michel Menu from the Centre de Recherche des Musées Français. And if you are interested, you can take a screenshot or take a photograph of this image and check it out for yourselves. There is also variation in quality in the underdrawings, and Menu and his colleagues note that this could suggest that Justus was aided by assistants at the underdrawing stage. In the London Allegories and Discourse, the condition of the paint and the thick layers of varnish and wax on the surface inhibits infrared penetration, making it difficult to interpret their underdrawings. Unpublished IRRs of the allegories made in 2009, so this is after Lorne Campbell's 1998 National Gallery catalogue with its images of the IRRs, so these are the more recent ones, slightly more legible, reveal some new details and more extensive changes than previously thought. But I agree that one does actually need someone like Rachel Billinge to sort of talk one through this. So let me explain that Rhetoric's dress was originally patterned. We might just be able to make out the sort of vestiges of a sort of brocade, sort of pomegranate, sort of brocaded silk there on her dress. Her shoulders seem originally to be slightly higher, and the angle of her head to have changed. She seems to have had a rather large headdress, perhaps, on her head there, and her head would have been more upright, not in the sort of downward slanting position that it is now. IRR indicates also that both works have been extensively retouched, but there is much original paint underneath, not all of it totally obscured. So, of course, the big question for the National Gallery colleagues now is whether to go further with an investigation. But sadly, I don't think anyone... Actually, I can just see someone there. I won't put you on the spot there, Christine. I'm just saying, is there anyone from the National Gallery here? But no, seriously, this is, I think, still very much just sort of a possibility. No one's gone further than saying, maybe. But I think a lot more investigation would need to be done before it was deemed safe to go ahead. Now, where have I got to? I've lost my place there. Anyway, listen, let's just move on there. With music. The original paint, that's where I was, which apparently more of it is just about visible in the steps and the man's tunic in music, which is recognisable by the stronger impasto. But listen, that is the thought of Marika Spring, not me, which I'm just repeating here for your benefit. But in both works, let's look at the coloured versions now, the impression is of paint applied very quickly, with little evidence of a complicated layer structure, such as you might expect in Netherlandish painting. Despite the drying defects, they reveal, however, a sophisticated understanding of the oil technique, evident from the different types of oil used in the preparation of the paints. In music, untreated linseed oil was used for opaque green paint of the textile, for example, on the steps, and heat-bodied linseed oil, which dries more quickly, for the green glazes over the top. Walnut oil, which is less yellowing, was used for the man's white sleeve. Seemingly, this was a workshop in which assistants played a considerable part in the painting process, although in the current state of knowledge it seems unwise to attempt to assign hands. Reynaud and Ressort believed that the famous men, as you have heard, were extensively reworked by a second artist, reinforcing the idea that Justus was no longer on the scene. Notable variations in the handling are evident even to the naked eye, for instance between the drapery of Bessarion, with its smooth finish and typically Netherlandish hook-ended drapery folds, which is presumably by Justus, and that of Aristotle, which is more fluid and gestural, with rounder, more volumetric folds. New research, however, by Michel Menu and his colleagues, suggests that the idea of two separate campaigns may be too restrictive, and that assistants could have worked alongside Justus on the famous men. Moreover, as these scholars have noted, some of the repainting of the famous men may be the result of interventions necessitated by damage when the panels were removed to Rome in 1631, when they may have been reworked in a manner more commensurate with contemporary taste. It has been claimed that Berruguete, or Petrus Spaniolus, worked with or took over from Justus, partly on the basis that the technique and style of the reworked famous men and the later paintings are not typically Netherlandish. Yet, given the circumstances in which they were made, it would be surprising if they were typical. Adapting to the working environment at Urbino with Italian and or Spanish assistants and catering to the demands of his Italian patron, Justus's style and technique would surely have evolved, possibly quite rapidly. The viscous impasto paint could suggest a workshop under the aegis of an experienced Netherlandish master pushing the medium in new directions in order to speed up the painting process in these large works. This type of handling is seen in works by, for example, the Urbinate court painter Giovanni Santi, such as here, drawing particularly your attention to the very sort of thick, viscous, oily green drapery worn by the angel here. But this kind of handling is also strikingly reminiscent of early experiments in oil painting by other Italian painters, not from Urbino, such as Piero del Pollaiolo, a detail of whose enunciation you see there on the left, and Giovanni Bellini. Just comparing here for you, just sort of ways of handling, approaches to light in folds. Here again, treatment of brocade, that of course on the right is a detail from Leonardo Loredan in the National Gallery. So these artists, Pollaiolo, Bellini, also often working rapidly on a large scale and, like the Justus workshop, exploiting the handling properties of the medium, notably in the creation of virtuoso effects such as sparkling metalwork or shimmering textiles. Scientific evidence can shed light on some of the painting processes used by Giusto and his team. The communion has a thin oil-bound priming on the gesso, as is typical of a Northern European oil technique, also found in many of the famous men. For painting, as we've seen, different oils were used for particular colours and layers. The pigments are standard ones, applied using a mostly simple layer structure. Analysis of the communion indicates that the chromatic range and colour combinations employed by Giusto must originally have been very striking. They may be reflected in works by Santi, such as the Visitation at Fano, or this banner of Tobias and the Angel, which have an unusually varied palette. A very interesting discovery is the presence of powdered glass in the communion and music. I don't know why I haven't illustrated those, but anyway, you know what they look like. This is the important point, powdered glass, a technique used by Netherlandish painters from Van Eyck onwards to improve drying properties and the handling properties of oil paint. Its use in Giusto's workshop explains why Santi and his son Raphael were amongst the first Italian painters to exploit it extensively. Guido Baldo's portrait in the Discourse is painted on a metal foil support glued to the panel. That's that, his little head there. This is a technique not uncommon in Netherlandish painting, in portraiture, but is unique in a painting produced outside the Netherlands. Often overlooked, this is a significant piece of evidence in the case for Justus's continued presence at Urbino. Justus's workshop was a crucible for Netherlandish oil painting in Urbino. In turn, he cannot have been impervious to the experience of working with Italian artists. From a purely technical point of view, the practice of transferring cartoons by tracing with a blind stylus, which is evident in investigations of some of the famous men, indicates a response to Italian practice. Traces of shell gold, a technique more common in Italy than Northern Europe, are visible in the draperies of Federico and Guido Baldo in the double portrait. Renaissance architectural elements are a feature of the Justus group and have been attributed to the intervention of Italian artists such as the young Bramante, whose activity in these years is, however, completely speculative, or Francesco Di Giorgio, documented at Urbino from May 1477. The situation may have been more nuanced, however. Justus was interested in architecture, as is evident from the ambitious church setting of the Communion. The contemporary Italian architecture and decorative features in works such as the liberal arts could reflect a response to the stimulus of working at the ducal palace, still under construction both inside and out in the 1470s. The design of architectural details, fixtures and fittings must have been a topic of discussion amongst the artists employed there. Rather than seeing Justus as an outsider, locked into a foreign way of working, looking and thinking, we might imagine him responding to the novelties of the artistic environment in Urbino, interacting and collaborating with Federico's other artists. It should not therefore surprise us if the figures and settings he and his workshop painted become more Italianate, particularly if we consider that it was perhaps the virtuosity and verisimilitude of Netherlandish oil painting that Federico admired rather than Netherlandish style per se. Nor should it surprise us if Federico, who had a very clear visual agenda, demanded collaborations between his artists on particular projects. This could explain the hybrid character of the liberal arts, in which Italian space and form meld with Netherlandish light and texture. Federico may have wanted a pictorial scheme that would reflect his triple passions, architecture, perspective, and oil painting, and showcase the specialist skills of the artists who graced his court. The ambitious scenography with full-length figures viewed steeply from below in a space that appears to continue across the panels and to be part of the viewer's space could well have been the brainchild of an Italian artist. Its realization, however, was surely left to Justus's workshop. The perspective is approximate. Orthogonals appear to converge, but do not meet in a single vanishing point. There are some awkward junctures, as in the top right-hand corner of music, which is sort of hard for you to see, but trust me, it is awkward. The architectural vocabulary of the thrones is eclectic, and the figures do not follow the same perspective as the thrones. Foreshortened limbs, draperies, and objects that break the fourth wall, as it were, would have been ideas familiar to Justus from Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, as illustrated there on the left. But his interest in foreshortenings and di sotto in su could have been spurred by the perspectival intarsias in the studiolo. An Italian artist may have provided drawings for the dazzlingly foreshortened organ in music, similar to one held by the figure of music in the Intarsia door to the Sala degli Angeli at Urbino, which is supposed to have been designed by Francesco di Giorgio. Conversely, the Intarsia helmet in the Urbino Studiolo was perhaps inspired by its gleaming painted counterpart in the double portrait, in a spirit of playful rivalry between workshops. And of course, just sort of to throw in somebody else who is working in Urbino at sort of roughly this time, who I don't think should be at all regarded as a member of Justus's workshop, but you know, these people are all looking at each other's work. Of course, Piero della Francesca there in the Montefeltro altarpiece, where, you know, a helmet, you have a very similar shiny helmet prominently displayed there. And of course, as has long been noted, the hands of the Duke here were repainted, apparently by the same artist who painted the hands of the Duke, or indeed was responsible for the portrait of the Duke that you see there on the left. But we're putting all of that to one side as well. We don't have time for Piero this evening. Instead, we need to roll to a conclusion. So, the double portrait, the liberal arts, and the discourse are distinctly more monumental in character than the earlier works in the group, and more volumetric in their conceptualization of figures. All employ ambitious di sotto in su viewpoints, unlike the Communion, which is viewed from above. The drapery folds in the latter group are softer and more sweeping than the clustered hook-ended folds of the Communion, the handling of paint more viscous and gestural. It is understandable why names other than that of Giusto have repeatedly been associated with them. Notably, and I'm leaving aside Berruguete here, I think we've kind of dealt with him for this evening, but notably those of Bramante and Melozzo da Forlì, who share this interest in low viewpoints and projecting forms, but whose palette and handling of paint are, however, very different. Their activity in Urbino remains elusive, even more so than Justus's, but these analogies might suggest an element of participation in and cross-fertilization with the Justus workshop. In turn, the famous men are surely reflected in Bramante's Heraclitus and Demosthenes from the Casa Panigagola in Milan, and in Melozzo's entry into Jerusalem. Particularly, I'm thinking about these ones, sort of shaggy, bearded, long-haired figures of apostles here who seem very, very close, this one in particular, very close to Justus's Christ. Or, indeed, not just in the entry into Jerusalem, which is in the sacristy that Melozzo painted at the Santa Casa di Loreto, which is of course not many miles from Urbino, but also I would say in the ceiling of that sacristy. Again, you can see some of these sort of slightly Justus-ish types in these prophets with their exotic headdresses, not unlike the Communion, not unlike some of the characters in The Famous Men, and I would also suggest that some of these wonderful angels with their very Netherlandish-looking drapery folds suggest knowledge of Justus's work at Urbino. The Justus workshop, or perhaps a more useful term moving forward, the Urbino workshop, or Officina Urbinate, as Francesca Bottacin calls it in her recent book on the Communion, deserves further thought. For instance, there's a subgroup of paintings, often, sorry, I have to shot myself in the foot here. I've just put up a few details there, lovely angels and prophets for you, just to underscore the point I made earlier. But to move on, there is a subgroup of paintings often attributed to Berruguete simply on the basis of their generic resemblance to key works in the Justus group, but which personally I do not think are by the same artist or artists as painted the Justus group. But this, as I say, subgroup, which include these two paintings, could perhaps, if they were investigated further, thought about further, perhaps could shed light on other members of the workshop or the ramifications of that workshop. To sum up, from Crowe and Cavalcaselle onwards, one of the stumbling blocks, look at that, it's nicer than it is actually. One of the stumbling blocks in accepting Justus's authorship of the group has been the view that a Netherlandish painter could not have developed in this way, or so quickly. An argument which, for that matter, could also apply to Berruguete. But why not, given the particular circumstances in which he found himself? Why should Justus not have responded to new stimuli in Urbino, just as Jean Fouquet did earlier in Rome, or Dürer later in Venice? And if not Justus, then who was the talented painter, proficient in the Netherlandish oil technique, who produced these works? Did Justus indeed die or leave Urbino after November 1475 to be replaced by a second unnamed master? Or did this second master work under his aegis? Was he a Spanish or an Italian painter? Was there in fact a team of painters trained to work in this new hybrid Urbino style, orchestrated by Justus, perhaps in collaboration with other artists and designers employed on Federico's projects? Ultimately, we have to make up our own minds. But whether we decide that Justus was responsible for these works wholly or partly, directly or indirectly, we cannot ignore his legacy. Thank you very much.